And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Ron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body in the process. This is the 8th episode in our Journey from the Scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to the discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, the genesis for our podcast name, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are in your journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct questions listeners pose, such as yourselves, that fit our current topic. You can reach us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. That's contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast so that you receive notifications. Make sure you hit that bell so that you're always notified when fresh content drops. We drop a new episode every Monday. That's every Monday. So we look forward to you taking this exciting ride through the scriptures with us. Before we jump in, it's helpful to note too that if you were with us last week, this will really feel like a very smooth continuation of what we built on too. We're still going to be talking about this very well-known Abrahamic figure and going a layer deeper, but also be encouraged if you've been with us since episode 1 several weeks back. We're going to pull in themes and some concepts, right? Just the connection to altars. Once again, the idea of recovery and restoration. We really want to make sure that as our listeners, you guys understand, though, that even though we're advancing in the story, a lot of the things that we've talked about from day one are still going to be integral to what we're discussing week in, week out. So as we jump in, I think this will actually help people even tie back to our last episode as well, Kit, too. What is the significance of Abram's journey taking him to an undisclosed land, emphasis on undisclosed, that he had not seen or secured in light of redemptive history and what God was doing through him?
Well, as we talked last time, the importance of God taking Abram someplace was because that place represented the provisional sacred space, as we put it. That place signified the place where Abram, whom God had disclosed himself to, would actually encounter and meet with and worship this God. So, as we noted last time, Abram wasn't a follower of the God of Israel. There was no Israel. He wasn't a follower of the creator God in the sense that he didn't know of him. He was part of the early Babylonian Chaldean Empire in Mesopotamia, and very much a pagan. His family, his father was a pagan, an idolater. That was the way people were at that time. And we don't know exactly how Abram was confronted with this God, how God made himself known to Abram, and why it is that Abram would even trust what he was hearing or whatever he was experiencing. But the text wants you to see that when God reached out to Abram was convinced that this was a true and living God, if not the true and living God, and that he was a God who could be trusted. So he called Abram to go to a place that he didn't even tell him where it was. And it wasn't as if God was saying, I have a cabin for you up in the mountains and I won't tell you where it is until you get there, but it's up there and it's ready for you and it's prepared. The Middle East then, as today, and the world in general, is populated with people and communities and nations and military powers. And so the idea of going off to some place that God says he's going to give to you, well, what about the people that are there? What about their military might? What about their nation? I mean, I can't just walk in and say, hey, this God spoke to me and said, this is the place he's giving to me. So it was a huge a
Yeah,
thing of
undertaking.
faith for
Yeah.
Abram to believe that what God was telling him was true. And that same dynamic will be repeated later in his descendants in the Israelites when they're confronted with going in and taking the land, and they realize that this is a land that is militarized and full of powerful nations and people and armies, and how are we going to take this land? So, but the point is again that God was saying, I'm going to bring you to a place where I will be with you. I will be your God. You are my man. And ultimately, I will be the God of Abram and his descendants. So Abram was believing this God for a promise of a communion, of an intimacy in a place where God could be encountered and found.
And I think as we've talked about it too, kid, is like the journey itself was actually an opportunity for God to develop the very faith and things that Abraham would need as he and his family engage and arrived in that promised land. And so often too is I think we forget like the logic of the gospel, right? The logic of redemptive history too, in that so often we want these things to be magical and fanciful. And oftentimes they're very practical, right? Like,
Right,
hey, at the end of the day, if I want people to build muscles, right? I'm not going to take some kind of special magical protein drink. I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to lift weights for weeks and months and years. And then
right.
my body over time will start to acquire and develop those very things, which will now allow me to lift more weights and move loads and do things too. It's very logical. And for some reason, I don't know if that's enamoring to people, special, right? It doesn't have the wow factor, but in many ways, God moves in very menial, practical ways too to accomplish these grand purposes, if that makes sense.
Right. And essentially, the Bible says there are two ways to live. There is this thing called faith, and there's this thing called sight. And sight doesn't mean just what we see with our physical eyes, but it means life and decisions and expectations
The
and
natural mindedness.
plans and strategies that are based on my own experience, what I can expect, what the statistics tell me, what experience tells me, what I can project to be an outcome. So it's kind of like following the breadcrumbs in the sand. Well, faith is the opposite. Faith is saying, I trust the God who has promised, not only in spite of the fact that I don't see this in front of me, how this is going to play out, but in many cases, even as we'll see with Abram, with the offering of Isaac, believing God when what he is directing seems to actually argue against what he has promised or what we think he's doing. And so believing God when it doesn't make sense, when we can't figure it out, when we have no experiential data points to say, oh, yeah, okay, I can see what this is. I can see where this is going. That's what faith is all about. And that's a very uncomfortable place to live. But that's what Abram had to do. He was going into a land filled with very powerful peoples and nations, the Canaanite peoples. And even throughout his life, he died still without having received that promise of that land. People forget that too. The book of Hebrews talks about he and Isaac and Jacob were wanderers and strangers in that land that was pledged to them. They had little bits and pieces of footholds, as we'll talk about. But Abram didn't inherit the land God was promised to him. He died as an alien and a stranger.
Indeed, too. And I think we'll also see, too, that while Abram was the chosen man, he was not the consummate man, too.
No,
Even his many shortcomings and failures along the way show
absolutely.
that God's preservation of the promise, in spite of that, shows, too, that yes, Abram will be integral to my plans, but my plans will not be dependent upon his faithfulness as well. And Ken, I think we even see that here in our second question, too, is that Abram built an altar at Shechem shortly after arriving at Canaan, and then soon after a second altar at Bethel, right? House of God. What does this altar building action reveal about Abram's understanding of God's design for him as his appointed agent of blessing? And then how does this help us understand why Abram built no altars while he was in Egypt? A distinction that I think many listeners may not have been aware of till we just brought that to their attention.
Right, right. Well, we saw that this idea of altars emerges after the fall, and that whereas the text wants you to see Adam and Eve's, the first humans relationship with God as intimate and natural, and there's no kind of distance or mediating of distance involved in that. After the fall and this banishment, this alienation has come into place. Now human beings have to interact with God through some sort of mediated structure, the symbolisms and sacraments, things that we talked about. And altars are a key part of that. A place where you will go and try to encounter this God through some sort of sacred exercises, offering of sacrifices, or whatever it may happen to be. But in the case of Abram, then, if altars, in a sense, kind of signify a provisional sacred space, a way for human beings in their alienation to encounter God, when Abram goes into the land, as he passes over the Jordan and crosses into Shechem, he immediately builds an altar, which is his recognition that this is the place of encounter. This is where I'm going to be meeting with my God. He builds an altar and calls upon his God. So he's recognizing again that God has brought him to this place as the place where I will be God's man. He will be God to me, and I will be his son in that sense, or his covenant man. He recognizes this is about intimacy. This is about relationship. This is about covenant, God and man coming together. And so as he travels south, he travels to Bethel and does the same thing there. Bethel means house of God. And we'll see that will become very significant later in Jacob's life, his Abram's grandson. So Bethel's a significant place, but that's the second altar that he builds. And then there's a kind of depiction of a forward-looking depiction of Abram's significance as the forefather of the people of Israel, because there's a famine in the land and he goes down to Egypt and he sojourns in Egypt. And that's a kind of, again, prophetic picture of what's going to happen to Abram's descendants, even as God makes a covenant with Abram. Israel itself will find itself in Egypt, Abram's descendants, because of a famine in the land. So there's that kind of depiction too. But as you said, when he's in Egypt, he doesn't build an altar there, because that's not where Yahweh is. Yahweh has associated himself, Yahweh meaning the God of Abram, who will become the God of Israel. This God who called Abram has associated himself with the land of Canaan. So in that sense, when Abram is in Egypt, he is in a kind of exile, just as Israel will later be in exile in Egypt. So he recognizes by building these altars, and then when he returns, he will go to Hebron, where he'll build his third altar. And Hebron becomes very important in relation to David, who becomes another significant figure later. So just as an aside, these places that kind of emerge as important in the Abraham story become very important in the later story of Abraham's descendants, the Israelite people, ultimately as they contribute to the developing storyline that culminates with Jesus, the epitomizing Israelite, the seed of Abraham.
And Kit, I think it's also important to note too that listeners may be wondering, it's like, well, it almost sounds like, Kit, what you're saying, that Abraham and others are very attuned with like understanding what is happening in redemptive history, because clearly Abraham was conscious too that he had actually built altars but didn't build one in Egypt. And I think the answer to that is yes. And even though Abraham at the time maybe couldn't have seen like the full scale and scope of these things beyond his own journey too, is he was keenly aware that God was using him as a very intentional instrument to accomplish his purposes. And I think that, to our point earlier that we made the last several episodes, should be encouraging to us, right? That even though we may not have the full scope and understanding of these things, our trust and hope is in the Lord who does, and how he is knitting and sovereignly orchestrating all these things unto his glory and edification as well, too.
Right. And Abram did see, we won't deal with these things in detail, but God through various means testified to Abraham's kind of singular significance, that Abraham was uniquely God's man. The war of the four kings and the five kings that Abram and his household play a role in, God is showing him that Abram, with a handful, a few hundred men from his household, are able to defeat four kings and their armies who defeated five kings and their armies. And so there is a preeminence of Abram, even in the encounter with Melchizedek in
Mhm.
chapter 14. And then later on in the episode with the king Abimelech, when Abram is granted this well, this foothold in the land, in a land that went on to become Philistine territory, that becomes very important too in the story. So God is bearing witness to the fact that He will be faithful, and Abraham is His man. And yet Abram is a very flawed man. And if it were up to him, the covenant would have failed and the covenant and God's purposes for the world through Abram would have failed in Abram's lifetime.
Right. Abraham repeatedly places the covenant in jeopardy, as I've alluded to earlier, prompting divine intervention. Yet Abraham's failures do not invalidate his covenant status or the grant itself. Note the Tamara's tree symbolism too, and we speak to that a little bit in the notes. What does this tell us about God's covenant faithfulness and his commitment to the promises he made to Abraham before his journey?
Well, as I said, there are two important episodes, and they kind of build on each other like stair steps in the early Abraham story. And the first is, as we mentioned, that after Abram arrives in Canaan, undergirded and strengthened by this promise of God that God has made to him when He called him out of Ur of the Chaldees, he, because of famine, is driven down to Egypt, and there, in fear, he hands over his wife, who at that time is still called Sarai. He hands her over. We know her as Sarah usually, but he hands her over to the Pharaoh because he's afraid he's going to be killed. And Sarah was his half sister. So he says, well, tell him that you're my sister and then it'll go well with me. Well, God has to intervene in that situation. But at that point, we don't really understand totally the significance of Sarah. God has said, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed, but we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But then later on, God makes it clear that the way this is going to work is that Abraham is going to have a covenant son. This blessing that will go to all the earth's families are to come through Abraham's line of descent, one particular line of descent, which begins with this son Isaac. And so immediately Abram believes, okay, well, if I'm to have this son, not only am I old, but my wife is old. And Sarah's first introduced in the narrative all the way back in that genealogy we talked about in chapter 11 as being barren. Even when she was young, she couldn't have any children. And now she's an old woman. So Abram naturally concludes, okay, well, Sarah's not the one. Maybe it's her handmaiden. So he and Sarah say together, okay, well, let's take Hagar to be your second wife. And because that probably is the one through whom God's going to bear a son for you. Well, then God later on says, no, it's not just through you, Abram, it's through Sarah as well. I will return next year and Sarah will have a son. Well, wait a minute, she's old and she's barren, but God's going to intervene. He's going to bring life out of death, which becomes a huge biblical theme. So now Abram knows that this covenant son, this son who is to come through whom all of God's promises are ultimately to be realized, that son's to be born to Sarah. And yet now when he next finds himself in Gerar with Abimelech, another king, he does the same thing. He's afraid for his life. He hands over Sarah, and God has to intervene and reveal to Abimelech in a dream, this woman is married, don't touch her. And God even affirms there the fact that Abimelech was blameless. Abimelech pleads his innocence. I didn't know. I didn't know. And God says, I know you didn't know. I know you acted in the integrity of your heart. Abram is the one who's at fault here. So even when he knows that his wife, Sarah, is to be the one through whom God will fulfill his purposes, Abram's still willing to throw her overboard for the sake of securing his own safety or well-being. He's fearful for himself. So he's a very flawed man, but God intervenes. And not only does he intervene, but he actually says to Abimelech, Abram is my man and he will pray for you. God is still, he says, I know you acted with integrity in your heart, but nonetheless, you have taken another man's wife. You've taken my man, Abram's wife, and therefore it's not going to go well with you. Death is coming to you, your household. And he says, but ask Abram, he's my man. He will pray for you, and then I will relent. Well, that story doesn't even make sense in a moral sense, right? It only makes sense because we look at it and we say, well, wait a minute. Abimelech didn't do anything wrong, and God's going to punish him with death and barrenness in his household. Abram is the guy who was going to throw the covenant overboard. He's the unfaithful, fearful, disobedient guy. And yet God says, he's my man and he'll pray for you, and I'll lift my curse of death upon your household. Well, it just again demonstrates God's faithfulness. It's not about Abraham, it's about the God who has promised. And God has sworn that all people will be blessed through Abraham. Therefore, for God's blessing to come upon Abimelech, it has to be through Abram. So it's another example. We keep seeing these ways in which God is showing, as you know, Paul puts it, it's not of him who wills or him who runs, but God who is faithful, God who has mercy. And that's kind of a long story, but you see in these two episodes again the building of the case that were it up to Abram, this would never have gone anywhere. But God is faithful, not only in preserving Sarah from another king's harem, but even in opening her womb as he promised. And that child will become Yitzhak. He laughs as kind of God's way of pointing to Sarah's disbelief. Oh, she laughs. This could never happen, but it does.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, Kate, and we've even alluded to this in our last episode, but like this idea of by sight is not necessarily just what you see with your eyeballs, but it's literally a natural orientation of man in his
Exactly.
mind, in
Exactly.
contrast to this idea of faith too, which is not just this principle, but it's literally once again an orientation into in terms of how your life is moving and how you're thinking and viewing. In other words, like it's almost in other words, and I think we've used this language before, is faith is of a different order, a different realm, if that makes
Right.
sense too, not simply a different practice, right? And it's like, great, I will now tie my shoes a different way. I think people have missed the boat. And so I think it's helpful to understand too that even as Abraham is operating by sight here, not in terms of his eyeballs, but in terms of that natural disposition, that God's grace and his sovereignty intercedes on behalf in preservation of the promises too. So God, once again, will always be faithful unto his own promises.
Right. And in
Um,
fact, most often, what we call faith is actually sight.
yes.
We put the label of faith on it, but what we're doing is we're believing God for what we expect to happen,
Yep.
how we interpret what we think He's promised to us, or we put our finger on a promise in the Bible and say, "This is God's word, and He's faithful; He cannot lie. Therefore, I can claim this promise." And we call that faith, believing God for certain outcomes that we want or we expect or we hope for. And that's the antithesis of faith. That is the very thing that we're pointing to as sight that God finds fault with.
Shifting gears a little bit, in what ways does Beersheba serve as the foundation for Israel's full inheritance of Canaan? And I think this is the part where maybe people might get stuck a little bit, even dominion in the land.
Well, as I said, this altar building project of Abram, he comes in to the land of Canaan in the north, south of the Sea of Galilee, but he comes to Shechem, builds an altar, goes to Bethel, builds an altar. Then he goes down to Egypt in the episode we just talked about. And then when he returns back up to Bethel and then ends up in Hebron, where he builds his third altar. But eventually he makes his way south. Beersheba kind of represents the southernmost border of the promised land in that sense. So you see this expression even in the Old Testament commonly, from Dan to Beersheba,
Mhm.
Dan to Beersheba. Well, Dan is in the very north. Beersheba is in the very south. So they're kind of like boundary markers in that sense. But Beersheba is where Abram digs a well. And in that part of the world, obviously, it's very hot, it's very dry, there's not a lot of water. And even where you have rivers or streams, they tend to be seasonal. They don't flow all year long. Even, the Jordan expands and shrinks with the seasons. But he digs a well at Beersheba. Well, you have to have a well to have a foothold. You can't have a settlement or an encampment or a community without wells. Wells were very important. And that became Abram's first. He dug a well at Beersheba. It becomes his first foothold there. Well, then the king Abimelech, he's in that territory that is really owned by those early Philistine peoples, Abimelech, this king. And this king comes and he recognizes the distinction of Abram, that somehow Abram has this distinction, this favor with his God because of all that is happening in Abram's life, his prosperity and kind of conquest powers and everything. So he wants to make a covenant with Abram, and Abram says, but your guys have been seizing my well here. And Abimelech says, well, I didn't realize that, but he granted him that well, that site as a grant, and they entered into a covenant together. Abram would get that piece of ground, that foothold, that well, that place in the land, and in return, he would show favor towards Abimelech. He would not rise up against him or raise any kind of army against him or whatever. So that was their agreement. But in commemoration of that, Abram plants that tamarisk tree there. And a tamarisk tree is it kind of symbolizes this idea of permanence, hardiness, durability. It's a living thing in a dead place, but that's very hardy, that will endure. And so it becomes a symbol again of Abram's gaining this land. God had promised him this land, but as we said last time, Abram will die without possessing the land of Canaan. He walks through it, but he never possesses it. But this is a first place that actually becomes his within his time in Canaan. And ultimately, as I said, that land sits within what would be a part of the ancient Israelite Philistine territory. So to an Israelite audience reading these things, they would very much associate with the fact that even at that point, God was giving to his covenant people this Philistine land. And we know that David is the one who constantly was battling with the Philistines before he finally gained a kind of dominance, enduring dominance with respect to them.
Yeah. And in many ways, Kit, too, like my mind immediately went to the idea of earnest, right? Or like an assurance too, or even the
Right,
first fruits, like,
right,
hey, the rest of their crop is coming, but this is
right.
almost kind of a down payment or an assurance too that the rest will be in like kind as well. And what's funny too is we see that throughout Israel's history as well, too, even leading up to the time of Jesus, that this idea of inheritance is central, right?
Yep.
Is like integral, right? We hear about birthrights, right? Inheritance too, and what is being passed down. And so even as you're talking too, it's funny how even when we're talking about geographical land, that even this idea of earnest or first fruits or an assurance, like, hey, this is a surety of something to come to. I know you haven't seen that, and I think just the encouragement that comes with that. Kid, as we wrap up our study too, one of the things too that I think some of our readers of our study notes, which hopefully everyone is reading and reviewing, may be wondering is the following too. We contend in those notes for this week that in the midst of his covenant son's shortcomings, talking about Abraham's, Yahweh would continue to be ever faithful, later disclosing his intent to resolve his children's failure by bringing out of Israel a faithful son through whom he would cause Israel to become Israel in truth. This is in reference to Isaiah 49, 1 through 13. How do Isaiah's prophetic words support this argument?
Well, this is another huge thread in the story that the scriptures tell. And often if we say, okay, what's the kind of the flow of the scriptures? We say, okay, well, there was creation, and then there was the fall, and then we have Jesus coming to reverse the fall, and then we have whatever, renewal and eternal state or something like that. Well, what we miss is a key piece in that, which we're even introducing now with Abraham, is that it's creation, fall, Israel, redemption, renewal, consummation. And that Israel piece is critical. And Israel is nothing but the family of Abraham. They are the covenant people of Abraham. They are, if you will, Abraham corporatized. When God makes his promise to Abraham and his descendants, that's who it is. It's the people of Israel, that covenant Abrahamic family. And so the promise that God has bound up, that in you, Abraham, and in your descendants, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, that obviously depends upon Israel being faithful to its covenant identity and calling. If that blessing is to go to all the earth's families, it has to go through Israel. It has to go through the Abrahamic descendants, or God isn't faithful to his word and his covenant. And what we see as the story plays out, we haven't even gotten to Israel yet, but Israel shows itself to be perpetually unfaithful. It not only does not fulfill its covenant calling, it's incapable of doing it. And ultimately, Israel is showing itself, will show itself to be incapable of being the agent of blessing to the world, because it's in need of the same blessing. It's in the same condition as the rest of the world. It can't be the solution because it's a part of the problem. And so we see that tension. How's God going to do this and preserve his faithfulness in his promise to Abraham? Well, the prophets start talking about how God is going to cause Israel to be faithful. Israel cannot. Just as we saw Abram fails, God still is faithful. Israel's failure becomes the occasion for God to start talking about he will cause Israel to be faithful, Israel to be faithful, to be Israel. Well, how is he going to do that? He's going to raise up from within Israel a servant, a faithful remnant or entity, a faithful Israelite, through whom he will reconstitute Israel, that it can fulfill its calling on behalf of the world. And that's a very high level flyover, but that's a central theme in the overall trajectory of the Old Testament that culminates with the coming of Jesus. And it's a central aspect of how it is that Jesus himself could say, all of the scriptures testify of me. That's a central issue, in that he comes as that promised Israelite who will be Israel indeed, in order that God's promises to Abraham on behalf of the world can be fulfilled.
Indeed. Kid, as we wrap, any final comments, anything that you feel we need to make sure that people have a very clear understanding on too, as we kind of move on too, because once again, like this train keeps moving down the tracks, and it's helpful too that as we get farther and farther away from the creation account, that people are pulling these threads through, but also holding on to these threads, because we're not going to drop any of them as we continue our narrative.
Right. Well, I think the main challenge, and certainly the main discipline, is to hold the pieces together. We've used that imagery of painting a portrait, and each brush stroke depends on it's determined by, in terms of its location, and all the features of a brush stroke on the canvas is determined by what's already been laid on the canvas. It's not arbitrary, it's not independent or individual. And so also it builds on what's there with a view to what's yet to come, and ultimately to the finished portrait that's in the mind of the painter himself. And the scripture works in that way. So when we see Abraham appear on the scene, we can't treat him in a vacuum, and we can't treat his circumstances in a vacuum. He is moving this project, this restorative project of God forward. God made a promise in the beginning that through a human being, he was going to solve the problem. And Abram is a key figure in that thing. So we have to read Abraham in the light of what has come before him, and then again, where this is going based on what God has promised. So as I mentioned even earlier, even as we interact with things like the Abimelech episode, where Abimelech is blameless, Abraham is at fault, and yet God, in a sense, exalts Abram and says to Abimelech, your future well-being depends on this man interceding for you. Well, why would he intercede for me? He's the guy that's at fault. I didn't do anything wrong. And when we want to just isolate things and look at things in kind of a moralistic or an exemplary way or whatever, then the Bible often doesn't make sense to us. If we don't read that Abimelech story in the light of Abraham's election, Abraham's calling, and what God determines that he will be, then the story doesn't make sense. It seems like God is punishing the righteous and rewarding the unrighteous, and that doesn't make sense in our natural sensibilities. So we have to follow the story and let the story interpret for us what it means and keep the pieces together.
Indeed, too. And so I think what my biggest takeaway is, at the end of the day, the whole is where we need our focus. But at the end of the day, we do need to understand the discrete parts and how
Right.
they actually make up the whole puzzle as well, too. And
Absolutely.
amen to that, too. Well, thank you so much for that as well, too. We sincerely hope this time you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And make sure you hit that bell for notifications so that you can be informed when fresh content drops. We look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.